Rights trial for the 3 former Minneapolis police officers who assisted in the arrest of George Floyd. Now, those 3 officers are J. Alexander King, Thomas Lane, and Tu Tao. They are all accused of depriving George Floyd of his civil rights on May 25th. Back in 2020, when he was placed under arrest after trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill at Cup Foods, the convenience store located on the corner of 38th and Chicago here in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin, of course, he was the 4th police officer on the scene that day. He has already pleaded guilty in this case, which is a federal civil rights case. And, of course, he's also now in prison for 22 years in the death of George Floyd. Rob Olson is in federal court. He's been covering this entire trial all along the way. He joins us now. And Rob, this is a federal holiday, so I think we should start by explaining why court is in session here today. Rob, can you hear me?
Now I can.
All right, Rob, let's start off by explaining why court is in session today on a federal holiday, President's Day.
Well, the court was supposed to be in session last Friday, but, pardon me, I'm hearing myself speaking here. But they had to cancel court because Earl Gray, who's the defense attorney for Thomas Lane, had to be in court for the Kim Potter sentencing on Friday. Now, the judge had been trying to get the judge in that case to move the sentencing back into the afternoon so they could still have court here in the morning and at least salvage part of the day. But when that wasn't going to happen, the sentencing remained in the morning on Friday, so he canceled court. He told the jury, we can't have court on Friday, but because of that, we were supposed to have Monday off. It's a federal holiday, but we're going to be in session. We're going to use today to make up for Friday, because this has already been a month now, and he had told jurors in the outset that he was hoping for a 2 to 4 week commitment for them here, and we're already at that 4-week commitment. So he's very concerned again about keeping this moving along as much as possible.
And on the stand today, Thomas Lane, former Minneapolis police officer, one of the 3 officers who was there on the scene that day. Rob, he testified this morning that he was just really kind of finishing his field training when the arrest of George Floyd happened on that day.
He had finished his field training, he said, about May 20th. So this is, May 25th. He'd had 3 shifts in, as a full-time police officer at this point. And typically your first shift, and what we heard from J. Alexander King is his first shift was he didn't leave the station. Thomas Lane wasn't as specific about what he did on his first shift, but again, you don't get out on the street the same way on that first shift. So he was in his 4th shift as a full-time police officer after his field training ended. He was working a shift from 4:30 p.m. until 2:30 a.m. So this came right in the middle of that shift that day, what he called his lunch break, even though it's dinner, but it's the midday break. And then it came as a call of forgery in progress, suspect still on the scene, and the caller said the suspect might be drunk or under the influence, possibly sitting on top of or standing on top of a SUV or van parked out on the street.
And he also testified, too, that as they were trying to take George Floyd into custody, at one point he actually pulled his gun for a very short time. Walk us through that testimony and how it relates to all of this.
Yeah. And you see that, too, in his body-worn camera video as well. That what he said is George Floyd was in the driver's seat of this blue Mercedes SUV. And when he said, I need to see your hands, that's a typical police officer response. They want to make sure you don't have anything in your hands. He raised his left hand, but not his right. His right was down beside him. And so that's an immediate red flag for an officer to say, why are you not showing me that hand? Why are you not responding to that? And so he drew his gun to escalate the situation, and he raised his voice, and he swore, and he said that is exactly what you do in that situation to get across the message that this is serious. You're not responding to these requests. You need to respond to the requests. He said, there's a stage here of ask, tell, make. You ask somebody to do something. If they don't respond, you tell them they need to do it. If they don't respond, then you make them do something. That came into play too later as they're trying to get George Floyd into the squad car. But then he did show his right hand. There's testimony that later it was more counterfeit bills were found down between the center console and the seat cushion, or the driver's seat of that Mercedes. So that is what they're implying that George Floyd was doing, was hiding these additional counterfeit bills at that point.
And a lot of testimony here walking through the timeline of events here during the arrest of George Floyd, and particularly, checking for the pulse. He testified that he tried to find his pulse on his ankle at one point, correct, Rob?
Yeah. And Earl Gray, Thomas Lane's defense attorney, walked him through then the sequence of events of trying to get George Floyd in the back seat, trying to calm him down. Thomas Lane said he offered to roll windows down and things to try to get him into the back seat. He was clearly uncomfortable. And then as he got more aggressively trying to fight his way, and he basically did start kicking his way out the other side, and then that's when they brought him down onto the ground and decided to hold him there. That's when they noticed that he had blood on his mouth or his nose. They figured that was from hitting the door jamb on the way out. An ambulance was called, initially code 2, which is, to get there in traffic, not emergency. And then they upped it to code 3 at some point, which is lights and sirens, get here as soon as possible. Holding him on the ground, as we've seen in other testimony and evidence here, Thomas Lane is the one that twice asked Derek Chauvin, should we roll him on his side? The first time the response was, no, he's staying where we got him. The second time he asked that, a short time later, he didn't get a response at all. He said that he thought Chauvin was just deflecting answering that, because Chauvin immediately asked him if he and Kang were doing okay at that point, which he said is typical for a senior officer on the scene to check on the other officers. But he said he felt like that was deflecting answering that question. He did mention that when Derek Chauvin said, no, he's staying here where we got him, asked, well, why didn't you push more about, rolling over to the side if you felt that was an issue? And he said that, trying to find the note here, he had said he was concerned about excited delirium, but why didn't he push him anymore? He said that since they had the ambulance coming, that he deferred to Chauvin at that point, that this was a situation where Chauvin felt he should stay down. The ambulance was nearly there, so he didn't push that any further. He did check for a pulse on his ankle because he was holding the legs down, the same time that J. Alexander King was looking on a wrist. He couldn't find one. Asked, why didn't you immediately respond to not finding a pulse at that point and turn him over and begin CPR, as the training has clearly demonstrated. He said that, like Kang, he didn't know if he just couldn't find a pulse there. He didn't see that as a reliable result. He said he could still see veins in George Floyd's wrists that were, bulged out. To him, that indicated there is still blood pressure there, and that is also when he heard the sirens of the ambulance, so he knew it was close. And then he saw the ambulance about a block and a half away. So not responding to lack of pulse, again, he said it wasn't guaranteed that there was no pulse, and the ambulance was nearly there.
And once the ambulance arrived and the EMTs kind of took control of the scene there, Lane made the decision to actually help load George Floyd into the rig, and he testified about that at one point too.
Yeah, and he also testified too about when the ambulance got there and the paramedic came out, and the paramedic, and you see this in some of the video too, that it doesn't come out with any state of urgency. He gets out, he walks over, he checks George Floyd's carotid pulse in his neck, and then walks back to the ambulance to get the stretcher. Earl Gray, the defense attorney, asking Thomas Lane, what did you take from that, seeing him moving without a sense of emergency? And he said, well, I took that to mean that George Floyd was okay. that if I had any concerns about his condition, if there was no pulse, that he would immediately turn him over and do CPR, but instead he walked back to get a stretcher. He said as he loaded him on the stretcher and turned him over and he saw his face, that's when he knew that there was a serious problem here. And that's when he went with the paramedic into the ambulance to offer whatever help that he could do, which initially was beginning CPR as they were getting the Lucas device out, which is the automatic chest compression machine, and getting an IV set up as well.
And Rob, we need to point out here that Thomas Lane is only charged in this federal case with not providing medical assistance, correct?
Yeah, he is not charged with the charge related to failing to intervene here. Just the failure to provide medical aid to somebody in your care, in your custody, and in your care. And so that really has been the focus of the cross-examination by Samantha Treppel, the prosecutor here. There's several of them, so they take turns. But she's going through basically a lot of Q&A that gets a response, yes, a lot of affirmative responses, just saying, this was part of your training. Yes, it was. You learned about side recovery, and you learned about CPR, and you learned about, positional asphyxia, which is, the difficulty in breathing when you're prone. He's confirming that, yes, this was part of training. And so this kind of gets kind of a lengthy testimony to go through a lot of these things. But she's really trying to get at the idea that if he had made suggestions about rolling him over, then obviously he had it in his mind that therefore he did need medical aid that he failed to render. And, pardon me, asked too, is that a sign when you said, should we roll him over? She said, you were concerned about positional asphyxia. He said, I was not. He plainly said, he was not concerned about that. She said, well, isn't that why you asked to move him on his side? And he said, no, I wanted to get a better feel for his condition, that he wasn't concerned about his ability to breathe. He did testify, too, when she said when somebody goes unconscious, isn't this when you're supposed to immediately, take some other steps to provide aid? And he said not always. Overdose calls, people would go in and out of consciousness. And so if they suspected drug use, they suspected this could be an overdose situation, he was saying that going unconscious didn't necessarily mean immediate medical aid was required. But that if the situation allows, you should start to do some of these things as soon as possible. But he testified a couple different times here in response to various questions that every situation is different. You have to sense the safety, the ability, and they knew the ambulance was arriving very shortly.
Now, Ms. Tremple also questioned him about the duty to intervene, which is largely what this trial has been about. And apparently she also said that technically Derek Chauvin did not outrank him there at the scene, but there's also been a lot of testimony throughout the past 3.5 weeks that under MPD protocol, kind of the unwritten rule there at the scene is the senior officer is kind of in charge. And even though these were two officers, Derek Chauvin was just an officer, Thomas Langen is an officer, they didn't outrank each other, but Derek Chauvin had more seniority, so they deferred to him. And there's also that power dynamic. That apparently former Officer Lang testified today that he was an at-will employee and he could still kind of get fired.
Yeah, and he said, she made that point, that this is not somebody who is that outranks you. You're both officers, which he affirmed. Yes, that's true. And so when she said, this is somebody that can't fire you the way a field training officer, when you're in that portion of your training can do. But Thomas Lane said, no, but this is somebody that still would have a lot of say as a veteran and as a field training officer, would have a lot of credibility that if he saw something that he did not like, he could certainly start the wheels in motion that would lead to his termination. And that since he was on a year-long probationary period as a new officer, that you are an at-will employee and you can be fired for any reason. So that he also felt that Derek Chauvin is somebody that, again, could easily say, I saw this, I didn't like it, and put the wheels in motion that would lead to his termination. He was asked about his termination too by Earl Grey. That's how Earl Grey finished his direct questioning, that he was fired the very next day. And he asked him how he found out he was fired, and he said he was sitting in a subway parking lot and he read a news article. He learned that he was fired from reading it online.
Interesting. Cross-examination already underway. Did it wrap up here at the lunch break, or is it still going to continue here at 2 o'clock when they get back in session?
It will continue, and it's hard to say how long it could continue. Some of the cross-examinations, in one case with Tu Tao, I think the cross-examination lasted longer than the direct questioning did. The judge had made a point to the attorneys after the jury left that day that, as a rule of thumb, the cross-exam shouldn't be longer than the direct. There's not a requirement there, but that's a general protocol. And so, they may try to make sure that they don't go longer than the direct questioning. But the cross-exam, I would anticipate it's going to take a little while yet, and then you get a chance for a redirect and then more cross. They'll go back and forth a little bit. So I'm guessing he'll be on the stand for a good chunk of the afternoon yet. But, again, this has been hard to predict. Other witnesses that I thought were wrapping up would stay for several hours, and so I guess we'll see here. But I imagine he'll be up there for a bit yet today.
And Rob, give us a sense.